So thanks so much for the introduction, and it is my pleasure as the moderator to briefly introduce each of our panelists this evening. So 3 of our panelists are from a wonderful nonprofit organization right here in Denver called the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. So first we have Sabrina Samoshima. She's the Children's Program Staff Attorney, and she serves abandoned, abused, and neglected immigrant children and vulnerable families. And then on the end over there, we have first Jessy K. Perez, and Ashley Bianchi. Jessy is the social worker and Ashley is the legal advocate, and they both serve recent arrival families through the Family Group Legal Orientation Program. And then sitting second in the line here is Dr. Rebecca Galemba. She's an associate professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, as well as the co-director of the DU Center for Immigration Policy and Research. So we're so honored to be here tonight discussing an issue near and dear to our hearts, migration. I got to see a preview of the play last week, and I have to say I was moved to tears multiple times as I recalled the harrowing stories of however many hundreds of clients I've talked to in my scope of work as an immigration lawyer over the past 10 years or so. And to be clear, that's harrowing stories about not just the journey of coming to the United States, but harrowing stories about what happens to migrants once they reach the US, including violence by law enforcement, labor exploitation, racism, being locked up in immigration prisons, as well as the daily stress of not having permanent legal status and constantly fearing deportation. So our mission with this panel today is to supplement the beautiful storytelling that happened in Refuge by providing some more context for the play, as well as an explanation of the immigration law and policy that surrounds the characters in the story and informs each of their individual stories. And equally important is to bear in mind that, that migrants are not a monolith. While Refuge represents one possible story, there is no one immigrant story, and people come here in many ways and for many reasons. So with that, I'll turn to the panelists. So at the beginning of the play, we're introduced to a Honduran girl who's risking her life to cross the border from Mexico into Texas. And there's also an opening scene in the play where Martina, the Border Patrol agent, asks the body of someone who has died tragically in the desert, "Why would you risk your life to come here?" And so the question that raises in my mind, and I'll start here with Rebecca and then move to Ashley, what are some of the reasons that people are immigrating to the United States and from Central America in particular?
Great. Thanks so much, Tania. And I'll try to be brief, although there's a longer history to many of these issues we often hear in the news, issues such as gang violence, in some cases even directed state violence, poverty, and more recently, climate-induced causes, especially to hurricanes that especially hit the areas of Honduras in the past year, hurricanes Eta and Iota. But what's really important to understand is that all of these more kind of proximate or immediate causes are very much grounded in longer term, both structural forms of violence as well as physical forms of violence, and the ways that these issues emerge from that, as well as compound those underlying vulnerabilities. And, something that I always stress my students to understand is when we look at a world of borders, who do borders exist for, right? They exist for the people who are often destabilized by, in the case of Central America, U.S. policies and corporations for whom there are no borders in terms of their own intervention, in terms of the government's military and economic policies in Central America. And again, there's a long role of U.S. foreign policy in both shaping as well as restricting the policy space of Central American politics, as well as economics that have compounded many colonial legacies of racial and economic exclusion. We have, for example, in a place like Honduras, not only a historical role as a primary export, primarily as many call the first banana republic, and the role of the U.S. In strengthening its military elite to largely protect those interests over its history. And now we have, again, the influence of a lot of extractive development, which we see now in climate change has actually exacerbated vulnerability through things like pollution, the risk to environmental defenders in places like Honduras, to deforestation as well. And what's important to understand about a place like Honduras, and I'll let Ashley elaborate, is that it was also the staging ground for the U.S. and its strategy to combat communism in Central America, largely in the 1980s, particularly to train the Contras and to destabilize the Sandinistas, as well as another staging ground for their interests in the region. And we've seen that stronghold of the military elite, largely with influence from Washington, has stifled attempts for democracy, for other forms of inclusive development, for pushing particular forms of development that serve private and foreign interests. And largely when attempts were made to try to roll that back, we see a really pivotal event in terms of the 2009 coup in Honduras, after which we've seen increasing instability, political violence, repression, as well as migration. I'll let Ashley talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll say following the 2009 coup, corruption in Honduras really did take off even more. Kind of speaking to what was happening back in the 80s, it was referred to as like USS Honduras as the staging ground for the rest of Central America. With Juan Orlando Hernandez, or like Ho, as he's referred to in Honduras, he created basically a narco state within Honduras, accepting, allegedly, bribes to provide like safe transit for drug traffickers, so police protection and military protection, supposed promises against arrest and extradition to the United States. And his government has done a lot to steal money from the Honduran government. They stole a lot of money from what's Social Security in Honduras, medical system, education system, agriculture, and transportation. And like a recent example of this is during the COVID pandemic, $48 million that were supposed to be used to make mobile hospitals throughout the country never materialized, and the money is just gone. Through the dedicated docket, which we'll speak to a little bit more later when I do speak to Honduran families, things that people have cited is the lack of medical care. Like they have to bring in their own medicines, their own pillows. Same thing with school. They have to pay, even if it's public school, you still have to pay to get into the school, to get your uniforms, your books. The history of like Chiquita Banana Company created this like strange environment in the country in which like education was like really easily like privatized, essentially, because the US companies were providing education. And once banana exports weren't as profitable anymore, they basically shut down the schools, creating this huge gap of education because the US companies didn't see the profit in educating their workforce, whereas previously they did. And Honduras has this long history of like privatized like corporate cities. So where the banana companies used to have that before, current day examples are more like the sweatshops, maquilas, that are in Honduras. Personally, in regards to like my Honduran American experience, is this interesting, like for me, it's, you know, I was born and raised here, so it's, you know, what people see as like something good and valuable, like my level of privilege is so high that I don't really appreciate the differences there. Whereas like people want to live in these corporate-run cities because they'll have more opportunities for medical and educational access than they would if they lived elsewhere in the country. So yeah, there are so many reasons why people leave. It will be to the points that Rebecca mentioned in regards to climate change. Domestic violence is another one. Crimes go unpunished. People get arrested, get released immediately. 9 out of 10 murders basically go unpunished in the country. And, you know, you'll see a parent leave and try to send remittances back to Honduras to take care of their kids as best as possible. And eventually, you know, the choice is made, as difficult as it is, to send their children solo to make this arduous journey, as Sara did in the play.
Thank you both so much for that context. I think another piece of this that would be helpful to understand is about Sara's journey to come to the United States, that we know that where the play picks up, it's actually a very long time into her journey from Honduras. So I'm wondering, you know, what may have happened before that? Like, what did she likely have to do leaving her home country and coming to the United States and making it all the way to the border? And a little bit about what that journey is like for migrants.
Right. Well, and I'm sure many are now increasingly aware of what this looks like, but the journey, and especially through Mexico, has not only become much lengthier, it's not direct, it's often fits and starts and returns, disruptions. It's incredibly dangerous and also incredibly expensive. And I think, you know, what we're seeing in a lot of places, why people started leaving in caravans from places like Honduras, often when they didn't necessarily have the migratory networks to be connected to smugglers, or because, as we've seen border enforcement, what many have called being outsourced from the United States to Mexico and increasingly now to Central America as well, what that's done is not deter people as that kind of logic goes. It's actually increased the costs and increased the risks that people face. And caravans are an historical response to that. We're going in numbers, not only decreases the cost of having to rely on smugglers who they may not have connections to or might be unreliable, but also expensive. And again, the being in numbers to decrease those risks to their own safety. And what's really interesting is we often hear from all sides of the political spectrum these kind of violent statistics about crimes committed against migrants in Mexico and even in Central America, in order to, or this, the trope of, migrants are vulnerable to smugglers and traffickers, but it's often used to justify harsher border restrictions. And the irony for those of us who've conducted research on this for a long time is that those very kinds of vulnerability and the lucrative nature of migrants have become, as many have called them, commodities, right, to many actors, is a direct product of these securitization policies that don't provide people with a legal alternative to move through space or gain other forms of refugee protection, that they have to then make this entire journey to just present themselves to even try to qualify for asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is a strategy that developed nations throughout the West, including the EU, including Australia, have devised to prevent people from getting status. Because once someone reaches the border, although some of you will talk about the obstacles to even applying for asylum that have been put in place, but ostensibly before, once someone arrives, they have the legal right to apply for asylum. And all of these policies that outsource enforcement downwards, what some people have called the vertical border or even the arterial border, are meant to prevent people from even getting to that place in the first place, to prevent them from even having a chance to apply for asylum. And I've looked at this a lot in Mexico, and in fact, I've examined a lot of human rights complaints that have been levied at shelters on the borders between Mexico and Guatemala. And what's interesting is that most of these abuses that are occurring against migrants are very much highly correlated with border checkpoints or crucial highway checkpoints. So not just the borders between states, but also critical junctures where there might be a roadblock or a checkpoint. And these aren't only committed by smugglers or even by drug traffickers, but in fact, many have shown, actually our data showed that the largest percentage were committed by government agents themselves. And so these elements of corruption. And, while Mexico has increased its refugee processing, it's still plagued by a lot of uncertainty. There's high degrees of impunity in Mexico. In fact, the last couple of years were some of the most violent that Mexico has had on record. It is very much undermined by limited staffing, and Mexico's more mandate, and with the U.S. agenda, to increase aggressive immigration enforcement and deterrence, which undercuts its ability to actually engage the protection process. As many have talked about, Mexico actually has some pretty good laws for refugee protection and migrant rights on the books. The enforcement is a whole nother issue. And in fact, we've seen obviously the rhetoric change a little bit between Obama and then to Trump and then to Biden. But what's interesting is if you look at the actual policies, many of those deterrence policies are still in place. And so there's agreements between Biden and Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador to increase their troop surge capacity to prevent people from leaving, which undermines people's protections to move within their own countries, as well as agreements between the Central American countries that are ostensibly supposed to allow freedom of movement between them. Some will also talk about the policies that have been kept in place or reinstated at the U.S.-Mexico border, despite the promises to repeal those. And so there's been this deliberate enlisting and funding, and, as Trump threatened with his own tariff threats to Mexico, right, to enlist Mexico and Central America in this aspect of deterrence to do that work, which is pushing risk and pushing the border further southwards, and in many cases throughout Mexican territory.
Anything else other panelists would like to add about this journey to the United States?
I'll just add a little bit of context of my understanding of how these caravans happen. It's a very organic process. Someone might start, social media is a big component of this, through a WhatsApp chat, meet in San Pedro Sula, March 25th, we'll leave at 4 a.m. because they usually leave pretty early in the morning. And they'll just have their small little group of 3 to 5 people. And then the messages starts getting spread. And then you'll have, 5, 6 people from one town, 5, 6 people from a family. people will travel as far as from Nicaragua or El Salvador to meet at the meeting point in San Pedro Sula, as an example. A lot of caravans have left from that city. And then they'll start the journey together. I think a large part of it is, to protect each other and also to show solidarity with one another, to keep each other's spirits up. And, people might feel a little crappy about what they're dealing with. And then someone will start chanting like, fuera ho, for the former president. And then they'll all start chanting together and meeting at those checkpoints from like Guatemalan military as an example. A lot of people don't even make it to the Mexican border. The Guatemalan military and police will round people up and send them on buses back to San Pedro Sula. And again, like as you're saying, just like repeating, people will just try the journey multiple times. So I can see an instance for Sara's situation, like it sounds like a 3-4 month journey more or less. And I can imagine someone like that going back and forth and trying to find ways, needing to stop at a certain town, perhaps to work, protecting herself against violence, and unfortunately getting abandoned by a coyote during the story. And for the people that have a little bit more privilege, so to speak, because the choices are still not great, word of mouth is really important for the smugglers, for the coyotes, or they also call polleros. Mm-hmm. I kind of like polleros because they refer to as the people that they're helping move as like their pollitos. So like humanizing the experience a little, I don't know, but anyway, sorry. If there's a parent, like I'm imagining Sara's mother in Florida wants to reunite with her daughter, and the best choice, given the circumstances, is paying someone. Word of mouth is incredibly important as to like who can safely help move my children across these borders. And I would say in this situation, that didn't happen. And unfortunately, that does happen in the Mexican border, and we see other examples, the waters between the Florida and Cuba, and other examples in Europe. And, these laws and stuff don't prevent people from moving. They will move if they feel it's necessary to do so.
And I'll add, we saw, Harris, visibly tell people after we thought there'd be a change saying, do not come, right? Repeating the exact deterrence narrative. But I also want to add that there's a mix, obviously, in Mexico of populations that have become much more kind of taking in that mediatized discourse and more suspicion towards migrants. We've seen communities kind of, also violently push migrants back, whereas previously they'd been more welcome. But I think it's also important to know that there is a lot of solidarity as well. And I've seen people, take in migrants to teach them the Mexican national anthem, right? Or kind of help them kind of convince migration authorities that they're Mexican. But again, because of these controls and the costs and the dangers, there are many people who are trapped for longer periods of time in Mexico, and oftentimes in communities that have already been neglected by the Mexican government, and kind of pitting these populations against each other, whereas previously Mexico has a long tradition of political asylum and welcoming people. But again, we've seen that sometimes becoming two-faced at other points in history as well.
I think an interesting thing to note here, too, is that under the Trump administration, there was an attempted change at the asylum laws saying that anybody who had spent more than 14 days in another country would be barred from asylum, right? So it likely took Sara many months to come like all the way through Mexico. It's a huge country, and so she may be barred from asylum if that rule had passed and was in place now. So on this note of border policy and leading into our discussion of asylum law, there's a moment in the play when the rancher yells at the girl. He gets visibly upset, and he says she should have just turned herself in to apply for asylum. And she screams back at him in Spanish, do you really think that that's possible? And so I'd like to turn to Sabrina and ask, especially for asylum seekers who are arriving at the border, what are the chances of being able to get asylum? And what were those policies like under the Trump administration? And then have those things changed? Or are we still kind of looking at similar circumstances now under President Biden?
It's more unfortunate that we have to talk about the bad dream that is Trump to understand where we are now. But to give him a little airtime, so for the sake of correcting what he has put out there, or the attempt to correct, under Trump, of course, the main headline was family separation. We saw this increase dramatically with federal prosecutions for illegal reentry, as well as first entries. Now, how did family separation occur? Well, at that time, Border Patrol was taking families who entered as a unit together and placing the parents in federal prison under those allegations that they illegally re-entered or entered the United States. And so that's how we basically got baby jails of thousands of children who were left to take care of each other and themselves. Now, we got a lot of promises from Biden, and we were really hopeful as an immigrant advocate. I don't think I've ever been more excited for an election, and also more let down. Here we thought Biden was going to do a lot, and granted, it's one administration. We still have checks and balances in our country. And this is where we're really seeing, unfortunately, the progress of Trump. He stacked those federal courts with his nominees, and now we're seeing this push and pull between federal circuits. Now, when the Biden administration challenges Trump, what happens? It goes to court. And who is deciding those court decisions? The people he appointed. So we're seeing this horrible tug of war around his policies, including this horrible tool called Title 42. And I'm going to use the word horrible a lot because it is horrible. So this tool was a part of the late 1800s, early 1900s around meningitis outbreaks, cholera outbreaks, and it was a tool intended to prevent people from entering the United States who may be sick. Okay. What it has been used now, it's been bastardized into a tool to prevent immigrants from entering the United States out of fear for their lives, and being turned around to go back saying that they're a risk because of COVID. Now, excuse me, how many people in Texas do you think are socially distancing right now? And yet we have COVID restrictions placed on people who meet a certain skin color spectrum. Now, have we talked about COVID around refugee influxes around the conflict in Ukraine? We haven't. Not even those European countries have mentioned that. But here in the United States, we have this ridiculous rule that we're trying to disguise as a way to protect our communities when we're turning people around who are fearful for death. So I get super pumped up around Title 42 because it's obnoxious and very two-faced as far as two-faced as it can go about politics. Another thing, looking at Biden, Rebecca mentioned it. We had Vice President Harris out there saying, "Don't come." As soon as Biden was done with his campaign, saying that he was going to stand for more humane immigration reform. Now, granted, like I said, he's one administration. There's federal courts that were being challenged. But yet, he did not shrink such policies such as the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico. He created a 2.0 version that actually expanded it to Haitians. And now we have these migrant camps along the border that are expanding because he's expanded who can be included in those. And let's not forget the migrant Haitians who came to the border for security, who were whipped by border protection. That happened under Biden. It did not happen under Trump. Yeah. That is still a problem that we're seeing today, not only at the border, but in those who are in immigration custody. There's an outstanding amount of disparity in how us Americans, the United States, treat Black immigrants. And, when we talk about Honduras, I think we should also mention they have a very strong and robust Afro population. And even just looking at the difference from nationality perspective, we see a dramatic difference in how those folks are treated, even though they're from the same country and probably entered within a week of each other. And that is very, very frustrating as an immigration advocate to hear that. And now, do I think Biden is going to fix it all? No. And who's going to educate our community members? Well, we can't put it all on the folks who are coming here saving their own lives. We as advocates and allies need to be able to not only elevate their requests around their personal lives and the decisions they're making for themselves, but we also need to amplify their stories in a way that's respectful, in a way that pronounces them in a meaningful and accurate way that they can feel proud of. So, I'm sorry, I kind of veered off. But
No, thank you so much, Sabrina. I think that's really helpful to understand specifically the policies that have impacted the border. And then we also know that there have been changes with how immigration cases are adjudicated once people are actually allowed into the United States too. So I'm hoping that Ashley, as a legal advocate, can speak a little bit about the dedicated docket and what that means and what's happening right now with those cases.
Okay, so I'll answer as best I could, and then Sabrina, if you don't mind jumping in to fill any gaps if I miss something. So, and I'm saying that because I'm a legal advocate and not an attorney, so I'm sure I don't know everything that there is to know. But my understanding is the dedicated docket is a new version of something that has existed at least since the Obama administration. He called it the rocket docket. I remember back then with that kind of like title, it was obviously racist. Versus now we have a very sanitized version, dedicated docket. It's like, who's going to know what that actually means? So if any families with children that entered the United States on May 28th and later, at the border are getting sent to the dedicated docket, and this is a court process that is supposed to be expedited, that is meant to be finished within 300 days, whereas the process for filing for asylum is 365 days. So they're even giving a smaller window. And a lot of these families, a lot of Hondurans in particular, like aren't even leaving with any like savings. Like they're just leaving with the clothes on their back, and they're just figuring things out on the way here. So the idea that someone can come to this country, figure out housing and employment under the table, potentially, and potentially finding a lawyer if they can't qualify for a pro bono attorney, which unfortunately there are so many families on this dedicated docket that an organization like Remain, it's going to be impossible for us to be able to serve all of them, even if it's just pro se support for them to do things as best as they can on their own. One example that I've seen that's difficult in regards to families seeking asylum is how many of them have dealt with different levels of extortion. And it's all on like super small businesses. So it could be your little, we call them truchas in Honduras, which is kind of like bodegas in New York City, like little corner stores, little grocery stores. Those receive extortion. Bus drivers, taxi drivers, street vendors of food, all of them have to pay like rent towards the local gang. And there are some businesses that are even extorted by multiple gangs. And it's like to protect them from each other. And the way that I'm understanding asylum law right now is that for large part, that's not a super strong case. But it's like they lost their livelihoods. And they're dealing with this internal displacement that they can't really easily move within the country and start over either. So that's my understanding of dedicated docket and how that hurts Hondurans in particular.
Yeah, Ashley has a really good perspective as she's like working directly with these families to give you kind of like the 1,000-foot view on it. In immigration court, there's no court-appointed counsel, even for the youngest child. I've represented a child as young as 6 months old. It's heartbreaking that not only have these families been displaced, lost their livelihood, but then are placed in the situation where they need to navigate not only a new culture, but a completely different court system that they may not have faith in, and that they may not like to be welcomed by the armed guard with the vest at the elevator either, because of their past experiences. Now to talk a little bit about this dedicated docket, it contradicts immigration law. By law, that's supposed to be good law right now, an individual has up to a year from their first date of entry into the United States to apply for asylum. And we are asking the vulnerable of the vulnerable, the fringe of the fringe, to get on this rocket docket train and be completely done with your case in 300 days, in less than a year. When by proxy about the date that you entered, again, another marker of privilege that you don't really realize you have until it's there is that you get a full year to fill out your application, not necessarily to complete your case. You may have even another year after that to prepare your case. You should not be pushing these families to file applications that are only provided in English by the Department of Justice, that are not given any kind of court interpretation outside of the courtroom when you're looking at a 20-page application that probably asks three questions the same different ways but are trying to get to the same topic. And that's the gap that Remain fills, or we do our best to fill. We're not perfect at it. But when these families are working through this system and there's no direct government support, we are the friendly face next to the guard in the vest at the elevator. We are the people that they call to help navigate their court date, because the court clerk, they have their own agenda. They have their own things to do. They're not going to be filling out 300 change of addresses for folks who decided that, hey, that distant family member that I had in Denver, not such a good person. I don't want to live with them anymore. And what kind of options do you think people have to leave those types of situations? Not very many.
I would just add, I've been looking through some of the statistics that have come out on the dedicated docket. And while I think you mentioned this whole idea of, rhetoric is that they're claiming this is not Obama's rocket docket, this is the family unit docket under Trump. This is efficient. This will be fair. This will respect due process. The early results are showing, I think, over 95% of these cases have been denied. So it's expedited removal in many ways, more than expedited dedicated processing from the data that's become available.
And just to underscore how important the work that Remain is doing right now is that they're providing not only the direct services themselves, connecting people to resources, but also training pro bono attorneys from law firms, from organizations around Colorado to come in and represent these folks. And I think the last number that I heard was that there are 4,000 cases right now in the Denver Immigration Court alone on the dedicated docket. So there's a really huge need for these services. So please donate to Remain. So I also wanted to come back to this danger of the journey issue. And part of, I think, one of the more devastating moments in the play is where we find out that the girl, Sara, had disguised herself as a boy to make this journey, and she had written, "I have AIDS" on her stomach in Spanish. And later she reveals that she was sexually assaulted by a Border Patrol agent as she was trying to cross the border, and that unfortunately he couldn't read what she had written in order to try to protect herself. So this seemed like an important moment to highlight because, someone comment for the audience why the girl may not have felt empowered to report that sexual assault in the moment. And also, if you could comment on that crime is generally underreported in the immigrant community, whether that's by, intimate partner violence, whether it's people in the community, or whether perpetrated by law enforcement officers, as happened in this play. So could someone please comment on that underreporting issue? Jessy, I wonder if this might be in your purview there.
Not too long ago, Colorado had SB 90, or as we know it as Show Me Your Papers, where law enforcement was allowed and even required to refer anybody who looked like they were undocumented or appear to be somebody who did not have a legal status in the country because they had an accent, because they didn't have a driver's license. So this kind of collaboration between law enforcement and ICE really broke the trust that was already missing in the community. People are coming also from situations of violence and trauma, and a lot of the times these have been perpetuated by law enforcement in their own countries, and that trust already is damaged. And when they hear that, I think it was 2006, and I remember that I had friends and family members who were being stopped and for minor traffic violations such as speeding or not having a driver's license. And I remember that my people were being deported in 2006 and for many years until that law changed, also because of advocacy efforts in the community.
Thanks, Jessy. So this might also be a good lead into some of the forms of relief that Sara might be eligible for now that she's in the United States, because so there's an application called a U visa that people can apply for example, when they're victims of crimes and they report it to law enforcement and they cooperate in the investigation. So we've talked a little bit about asylum, and we've talked about how she was the victim of a crime in the U.S., and I'm wondering if Sabrina could fill us in a little on how this immigration system actually works when people get here, or how it doesn't work, I suppose, depending on your opinion. And then what are some of the things that Sara could do to try to get legal status?
So the legal term is no, as far as where it'll be quick. Yes, there is a line in the play where the rancher, I believe, says you could apply for a special visa, and I think that's the U visa is what I think he was alluding to. So the U visa begins at an investigation of a crime, and as what we saw in the play, there is systematic corruption happening in that border patrol relationship, where the person that perpetrated the crime against Sara is a known perpetrator. That Martina, the border agent that played a role, a more centered role, says that, oh yeah, he has had 10 complaints and nothing has been done. And why do you think nothing has been done? Why should we encourage Sara to take faith in that system when a colleague who sounds like even reported the offending officer for sexual harassment herself, nothing was done? And that goes back to like whether people feel safe reporting the crime. Well, is the agency that we are supposed to feel secure in is safe to report the crime to? Now, this is interesting, right? Because they're like, well, there's more than one agency, Sabrina, right? There's the police, there's not only Border Patrol. Yeah, there's these weird imaginary borders that we create in our legal system called jurisdiction. And sometimes it's like a hot potato that they're like, wait a second, this happened in the purview of the detention center. Well, that's considered federal jurisdiction, so that should be, investigated by ICE. You're like, wait, ICE is a colleague. This person works for ICE. They are going to know their investigator. My client doesn't feel comfortable knowing that the person that's going to be investigating their crime is a colleague. How are we creating those safeguards to make sure that reporting is safe? As an attorney, I can't guarantee that. I can't guarantee that there's not going to be some kind of reaction to the action they're taking to protect themselves. And we could say the same for those who are survivors of intimate partner violence. We can encourage a person till we're blue in the face to call the police, but do we know why they're not calling the police? Can we respect their decisions about maybe what they've experienced in their home country, or even within the four walls of their homes, knowing what their perpetrator is capable of? Right. So in the sense that a person can just get a magical visa, doesn't exist. And even if they're willing to take that risk, the wait time is excruciating. Right now, for a U visa, this kind of let's make lemonade out of lemons of this horrible thing that happened to you. And when you're brave enough to finally step out of the shadows of your perpetrator to tell us about it in a very intimate way. One of the things I love and hate about immigration law, it is extremely personal. I have to walk in to my client's space, mental, physical, emotional, and ask them to tell me every horrible thing that happened to them. I had a colleague that told me, okay, so now you're the client. Imagine your most wonderful sexual experience. Now tell me about it. Okay. Now tell me the most horrible thing that's ever happened to you. And tell me about it. That's what we're asking our clients to do on the daily. And this is how they have to present themselves, because this is the evidence that immigration agencies look like to support these forms of humanitarian relief. You know, when I said the wait is excruciating, to put a number on it, you know, my colleagues are averaging anywhere from 17 to 20 years. What has happened in the last 20 years of your life? What things do you need to survive for the last 20 years of your life? You know, these are folks who are waiting for work authorization, waiting for the chance to be a resident to get financial aid, to be eligible for a scholarship. You know, that isn't, it is half of a lifetime, if not an entire lifetime, right? So what is the holdup, right? It's our laws. You know, when the U visa was created, there was a quota that was set on it that only 10,000 can be granted every year. Yet 8,000 are submitted every month. So the wait list right now, we're looking at maybe 7 years right now, you know, we're getting approvals for some amazing cases that were filed in 2014. But you can imagine, you know, with the U visa, there's been some trust in the US government. So we're getting more applications. But has the quota number changed? It has not. So we're providing this window saying, hey, you can do this, but you'll have to wait half your life.
Thanks so much for highlighting these. And I think, you know, it's just worth underscoring with this play that it does a nice job of highlighting that, you know, it may not even be possible for her to qualify for the certain types of relief, right? So maybe she doesn't even qualify for asylum. Maybe she misses the 1-year filing deadline because she can't find an attorney or can't pay for an attorney herself. She might be waiting 7 years to file a U visa application if she ever did manage to report that Border Patrol officer, and then she would face the likelihood of whether the US government would grant a U visa based on an incident perpetrated by, you know, one of its own. So I think those are some really interesting themes that are raised in the play itself. And I think one thing we haven't talked much about yet is immigration detention. And that, so people are sometimes detained when crossing the border itself, but then also they're detained within the interior of the United States. So I'm hoping that one of the panelists could speak just briefly to, you know, are there immigration detention centers in Colorado? Where are they? And what's that detention kind of look like, knowing that this is a civil and not criminal detention?
So Remain has two main programs. We have our children's program and our detention adult program, which unfortunately each has their own detention center. We have a children's detention center located in Westminster, Colorado, that is slated to hold young girls as young as 12. It also holds young boys who are at the point of aging out. That means almost turning 18. So what happens when they turn 18? Do they get papers? No. Do they get the boot? Yes. They're released from detention into kind of an unknown adult world, right? We have two immigration courts in Colorado. One is the Denver Immigration Court, which serves those folks who are non-detained. So that's a lot of the people that Jessy and Ashley and I meet. And then also the Detention Center Immigration Court, which is located in Aurora, Colorado. And that's a place where our moderator, Tania, and her students also provide us a lot of support by representing those folks who have to remain detained, either because they can't pay a bond, because they're not given a bond, and they're forced to fight their case from inside the detention center, which in its own right is kind of like a rocket docket. Mm-hmm. It moves very, very quickly and requires a lot of attention, not detention, excuse me. And, you know, being inland is, you know, thankfully we don't see a lot of detained families because we don't have a family detention center here. But we do see families who've gone to excruciating circumstances to come here. And I just wanted to reserve a couple minutes to talk about a form of relief that I'm kind of hopeful about for Sarah. There wasn't a lot of mention about her biological father. There was a lot of talk of her emotional connection to her mother. And that, of course, couldn't help but make my eyes twinkle a little bit, that maybe she could be eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. And as a 17-year-old in Texas, you can, but you got to act quick because you need to do that before you turn 18. But for a special immigrant juvenile status, the child must be declared a dependent of a juvenile court. And that could be in even an affirmative custody or guardianship situation. It could be an allocation of parental responsibilities where they're maybe taking like 100% of the parental rights that mom and dad have together, and they're transferring them. You can think about it as transferring it all to the mom while they're here in the United States. It's not quite like an adoption. It's kind of a different animal of that. And they have to be deemed abandoned, abused, or neglected. So if dad was never a part of Sara's life, this might be a good way for her to go. In addition, it has to be highly dependent, though, on this local court, which would probably be in Texas or Florida, asking for another additional order to determine that it's not in her best interest to return to her home country, and that reunification with one or both parents isn't an option. Now, I highlighted her age specifically because it's very state specific. In different states, they have different kind of these age lines. Now, in Florida and Colorado, you have up until you turn 21 if you're seeking special immigrant juvenile status. So Remain, and this is one of the things I love to brag about our organization, is we also make strides in our local legislation to talk about bringing, just making that little switch, just saying, hey, not every kid over 18 needs to be extended this juvenile court proceeding. But if they're seeking special immigrant juvenile status, they should be. And because of that, we have another great number of people who are in need of service to represent, to help them through this process. And again, it's very heavily reliant on local courts, and it could look very different from our corner of Denver to, a rural community of how that court needs to have their information packaged, how it needs to be educated, and then also finding folks to help us with those cases and help represent these young folk through this process. So thanks for letting me take that window of time.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the SIJS issue, the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status issue as well. And so we have time for one more little theme to discuss from the play. And I think one that feels especially relevant right now is this theme around the questions of brownness and otherness that happens throughout refuge, that we have, the American dog versus the Mexican lobo. We have the Latina Border Patrol agent who, was lucky enough to be born on this side of the border. And so the rancher, opens the gate for her, invites her to sit, gives her food and water and everything, which are the exact things earlier in the play that he denies to Sara, all by accident of birth, right? And so one thing that we're seeing is disparate coverage in the media, like especially last year around Central American refugees coming to the United States, around Middle Eastern refugees like Afghans coming to the US now, with with coverage of Ukraine, right? So our hearts are, of course, with refugees worldwide, but also it's been interesting to note in the media the different approach there has been to talking about refugees from different areas. So for example, a CBS correspondent has come under fire in the last few days for saying that what's happening in Ukraine is so concerning because, quote, this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, end quote, place. Right, so this raises some questions. And so what I'd like to ask the panel, and I'm hoping Jessy might chime in first potentially, is what role does race, racism, and socioeconomic status play in how our public in the United States perceives migrants, as well as the public's perception of immigration law and policy?
Yes, one thing I'd like to address is that when we think of refugees and when we think of immigrants, I would like us to bring us back to think of like they have a story, we have a story, and that this story is a story that is like tied to colonization, exploitation, and taking things away from indigenous people. And it is not surprising, or it is not a coincidence that the people who are the most vulnerable and struggling the most and have endured trauma prior to migrating and during the course of migration, and as Sabrina and Ashley very well explained, once they are here trying to get their documents or trying to get some status, it is not surprising that those people happen to be indigenous people, Black people, Haitians. And I think that when one of the things that remained us that feels very important is that we see the person as a whole. We when these things happen, they are legal needs and they are human needs, and we have attorneys on staff who help us take care of the legal needs, and we also see a lot of the human needs. And I work closely with Ashley to look into those, to talk to people, to connect them with resources. 10 years ago, when doing this type of work, we had families of mixed status where the parents were undocumented and the children had some status, so we could help them, connecting them with supports and other systems because the children had some status. And now we have entire families who don't have a status and also do not know how to navigate the systems. So as somebody who is in the helping profession, and I think any profession in which you are, I like being a social worker because I am required to be asked, why am I doing this? What are my motives? And I think that's important. What are your motives? Are you doing this for yourself? Are you doing this for your clients? And doesn't mean that, I guess to me what it means is that to be in tune with the population we're serving. And when it comes to refugees, that's something that I think we all have to take into account.
Beautifully said. I feel like we could talk easily for another 3 hours, but unfortunately our panel is coming to a close. So really quick, I just wanted to plug a couple things. There will be resources posted on the page where the recording of this panel will be. And we encourage everybody to check out DU's Center for Immigration Policy and Research, and please visit Remain's website. It's rmian.org. Thank you so much to our panelists today, and thank you to our audience for being here.